Secrets in Prison. Susan, Carl, and Cindy were shoved into a cell and stumbled over each other on the ground. They had been beaten. In her 60s, Susan had a bleeding split lip and a sore jaw, and wincing in pain, she held her face. In their 20s, Carl and Cindy grabbed each other. A husky tomboy, Cindy was 6 months pregnant. High-strung at 25, Carl tried to hide his emotions. With a black eye, he took off his broken glasses. He was slender and agile. "You okay, honey?" He picked Cindy up. "Grandma." Cindy looked to Susan, who was standing up. Attractive but aging, Susan had an expressive face. Pouting and angry, she stood up, and a guard in the doorway had a rifle trained on them. Puffing and exhausted, the three of them nodded at each other that they were all okay. They looked around the dingy small cell, and it stunk like sewage and urine. "Oh my God, woof, woof." Susan waved her arm around from the smell. And outside the cell, they heard screams and whining from fear and pain. People were being punished and beaten. All this for speeding 5 miles above the limit? Carl glared at the guard, rubbing his sore stomach from being hit in the gut. "You shouldn't have talked back to the cop, Carl." Cindy whined, feeling her stomach. "This is absurd." Defiant, Susan tried to adjust her torn blouse and wiped her pants off. She was always conscious of her appearance. "Let's get out of here." A skinny young man brought in a tray of food and a bottle of water, and Carl and Susan noticed the bottle had been opened. The overcooked food looked mashed and not very good. The young man rushed out. "Eat it," the guard snapped at them. Fighting her tears, Cindy was rubbing her upper right arm. Her arm had numbers burned into her skin. 719. Carl had 720, and Susan had 721 on their arms. "What's going on here, anyway?" Rubbing her stomach, Cindy turned into Carl's arms. Worried about her, Susan and Carl stared at each other. "Where are we?" Susan looked around. "I demand a lawyer and a trial." FEMA camp?" Carl stated, worried that he was correct. Sniffling, Cindy reached for the water, but Carl pulled her arm back. "Don't." Susan shook her head, insisting, and stared at Carl. They were both sure it was poisoned. They heard Bill's voice coming down the hallway. "That's 721 on this trip. Excellent." "They're not eating the food, sir." The guard looked down the hallway. "Well, in that case." Bill stepped in the room and pulled a gun out and aimed it at them. In his 60s, his dark brown eyes opened wide, recognizing Susan. Startled, Susan gasped, recognizing him. "Bill!" "Susan!" Bill tried to hide his surprise. Carl and Cindy looked at them, staring at each other. There was an attraction between Susan and Bill. "Oh my God!" Susan grabbed her head, spinning around. "I'll be damned." Susan Drake, Hollywood icon. Bill had a hard glare on her. Their stares turned to anger and revenge. "Come on, Bill, after what you did to me?" Her blue eyes stared at him. "Eat it, all of the food," he demanded, and then turned to the guard. "Leave, I'll handle this." And he left immediately. Carl shook his head at him as he held Cindy in his arms. "It's poison, isn't it?" Susan shook her head in disgust. "Trying to add us as victims of the New World Order won't work." "You will eat it." Bill turned his gun directly at Susan. And gasping, Cindy jumped, worried. "Grandma, what's going on?" Susan's stare was hard on Bill. "After what you did to me?" "You!" Bill's breath got hard and fast. "Remember what you did to me, you traitor?" His eyes didn't blink. Carl and Susan noticed his pupils thinning into vertical slits with a green-yellow tinge to them. "Oh my God!" Carl covered his mouth and all. He's a worm," Susan snapped at him. "No, snake in the grass." Her anger grew as she stared down the barrel of the gun. And Bill looked at Carl and Cindy. "Your family?" "Yes, my granddaughter Cindy and her husband Carl. It's their first baby." "Wonderful. They can go with you." "You first." Susan didn't budge. "You're a traitor. You sold me out. Made me lose my job. You used to be one of us. What happened to you?" he insisted. Susan sighed. "That was a long time ago. I discovered the truth about the fluoride in P&G products I was endorsing, which you were in charge of. Those ads you developed for advertising got you in trouble, and my researcher went deeper than that." Bill nodded. Yeah, and I had to take the heat. Well, Susan shrugged, looking him up and down. Looks like you got a new job with FEMA. Very convenient. I heard the director died. But Bill wasn't listening to her. A whistleblower to boot, trying to win over converts. You think you're fooling anyone with your code name in interviews? What's going on here? Carl insisted, puzzled. I lost that part of the James Cochran movie because of you, telling him I was sick and in treatment. When you're with me, you stay close to me. Plus, they weren't listening to each other. Plus, Jamie Hudson got the Oscar for that role. I thought that year together meant something. Hey, Carl exclaimed, wondering what was going on between them. That was a long time ago, he insisted. The affair meant something to me. Susan was attracted to him despite her husband and son. And Bill shook his head at her. Just another Hollywood has-been. Hey, Cindy was also insulted. She's the best. She got 2 Oscars. And Bill held the gun on her. You signed a contract with you-know-who. Bill snapped back at her with the gun in her face. It has to stop, Bill. It's over. Their eyes on each other didn't budge. Stop what? You dummies don't deserve this world. We do. We're on to your kind. It's over. They were both very stubborn. This plan has been going on for centuries, and everything is falling into place, he insisted. You'll just fall, period. Susan had to admit her whole life was her own ego trip. She was out for herself and no one else, which included alienating her family. And when Susan found out her fans got sick from products she endorsed, she started to investigate the conspiracy, lies, and deception in Hollywood and everywhere else. You first, Bill demanded, stepping closer to her with a gun on her face. Just another missing family. Looking at Carl and Cindy, Susan realized how much she loved them. They were all she had left. Shaking, Cindy was folding her hands in prayer and clutching her bulging stomach around her folded hands. Becoming angry, Carl's fists and jaw clenched. Susan and Bill weren't paying any attention to them. Quickly, Carl hit Bill's gun arm up, and the gun went off between Susan and Cindy, and they both jumped, grabbing their heads. Enraged, Bill turned to Carl and hit him on the side of the head with his gun, and Carl's glasses flew off him. Holding his face, Carl flew to the floor and rolled over. He winced in pain. Carl! Cindy screamed, rushing to his side. Bill turned his gun on Carl, ready to pull the trigger, and gasping, Carl grabbed his mouth and jaw. And Bill noticed something that had brought back bad memories. Carl's wrist had burned scars on them. Carl looked up at Bill, staring down at him. And staring into Carl's dark eyes, Bill saw his wife and didn't want to believe it. Take your shoes off, Bill snapped at Carl and aimed his gun at him. Carl, you all right? Cindy was beside him. Rubbing his face, Carl sat up and took his shoes and socks off, and Bill looked down and saw burn scars on the bottom of his feet. Is your birthday September 9, 1989? Puzzled, Carl looked at him, nodding. Your real name is Joseph. You're my son. What? Carl stood up in shock, staring at him. You were 3 years old. We were supposed to sacrifice you, but Rita, your mother, got you away from me and ran. I never saw her again. I think she committed suicide. And tensing, he clenched his fist and jaw. He didn't want the remorse and fought to ignore it. You gotta be kidding, Susan snapped. In shock, Carl kept shaking his head, not wanting to believe it. He barely remembered his mother. He was raised in foster homes, but her name was Rita. He kept scratching his head, not wanting to believe it. The baby gave Cindy a hard kick, and gasping, she stumbled, losing her balance, and fell on Bill. He's not your grandson, she snapped, clutching her stomach. And staring at her, Bill didn't like the idea. It took him off guard for a moment, and the gun slipped out of his hand, and Susan grabbed it, aiming it at Bill. We're getting out of here. Shaking, Susan gulped and held the gun in both hands. Bill sneered at her. You won't get 2 feet from here. The guard is just down the hallway. Not if we have a hostage, Susan was sure. Carl picked up his glasses. He realized his anger wasn't getting him anywhere. He tried to calm himself. Bill kept his eye on the gun and sidestepped towards the door, not sure if the guard was nearby. He pretended to stumble and jumped Susan, getting the gun away from her, then grabbed her around the neck. You'll never change, Susan was gasping. You're all shark bait. Bill looked at Cindy and Carl. You'll be gone, and we'll have our new world order. In your dreams, Susan snapped at him. Welcome to the real world. And then Bill shoved Susan across the room to the floor. Carl helped Susan up. Staring at each other, they knew they were on the same side. Carl had been researching conspiracy theories and metaphysics for 10 years. And he respected Susan and followed her ideas about shadow governments, corruption, and bankers' control. Will you two stop it? Cindy started crying, holding her hands in prayer. We need to pray. God help us. There is no God, Bill smirked at him, and we won. You'll be our slaves or gone for good. No, Carl shook his head. You're not my father, and you're not the grandfather of my son. Tensing in anger, Carl tried to calm himself. What does that make us? Susan's eyes were rolling around, puzzled. You... Snake in the grass, Carl interrupted Susan. Please, we need to pray, Cindy was pleading, and Carl sighed. Oh, for God's sake, Cindy, knock off the God stuff. That's all you ever do. Sniffling, Cindy was crying. Carl spun around disgusted. Oh, God, I'm sorry. What a bunch of assholes. Bill was sure. You don't deserve this world. Everything is falling into place. Breathing deeply, Carl closed his eyes, calming himself. Susan watched Bill with his gun on Carl and Cindy. You hurt them out. And Susan's jaw was clenching tightly, but Bill turned to her abruptly. You can't do anything. Carl remembered his research on fear and love. Cindy was in fear, Susan wanted revenge, and Bill hated them all, and Carl saw it in their eyes. No, Susan. It's not our way, you know that. Give me your hand. Carl reached out to Susan, and she took his hand. Cindy, take my hand. God and love is stronger than fear. It's okay. With a quivering mouth, Cindy nodded and took his hand. He was between the two women. What the hell are you doing? Bill wondered. Love. Love is the answer. Love, forgiveness, compassion. Carl looked directly at Bill. Staring at Carl, Susan knew he was right. She had been selfish all her life. She looked to Cindy's baby, knowing it was her great-grandson. It's okay, Cindy. Remember our love? And for our baby, it's very strong. The three of them held hands. Send that love to him. And then Carl looked directly at Bill. You can do it. Let it go. Carl looked at Susan. What the hell? Bill shook his head, disgusted, feeling uncomfortable. Don't. He aimed the gun at Cindy's stomach. It's okay. Close your eyes. Cindy, Susan, envision all the love going to Bill. Carl kept staring at him. Killing us will just get us to our new world quicker. Keep killing everyone, and you won't have any slaves to serve you in this 3D world. For the first time in his life, Bill was worried. Susan, Cindy, and Carl's hands glowed with light. Then that light flashed brightly, filling the whole room, blinding Bill. He jumped and fired just as the three of them filled with light, and in a split second they moved and walked out the door. And the bullet missed the baby, went into the wall. Thank you for listening. Can this possibly be true of what is happening today in our world? Well, you be the judge. Do some research.